What Hitler told his secretary hours before his death. Suddenly, there's a sound of a shot, so loud, so close, that we all fall silent. Those are the words of Traudl Junge, Adolf Hitler's 25-year-old secretary, and she was one of the very last people to see him alive. For the last 10 days of the war in April 1945, she lived 50 feet underground in a concrete labyrinth, as Berlin was literally being blown to pieces above her. While his 1,000-year empire crumbled, Hitler called her in to type his final, hate-filled message to the world. But his very last words to her personally were something totally different, a calm, chilling farewell with specific instructions for her to survive. This is the insane story of what Hitler said in his final hours, through the eyes of the woman who typed his will and heard his last goodbye. By April of 1945, the war in Europe was basically over. The once unstoppable German army was shattered. American and British troops were flooding in from the west. And from the east, the Soviet Red Army, a force of unbelievable size and anger, had wrapped itself completely around Berlin. The city was a smoldering ruin. The Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, had shrunk to the size of a few city blocks. And its entire government, along with its creator, was trapped in an underground bunker. They called it the Führerbunker. It was a world of its own, a 2-level concrete dungeon that witnesses later called a concrete coffin. The air stank of damp concrete, sweat, and cheap perfume used to cover up the smell of pure fear. Outside, Soviet artillery pounded the city 24/7, shaking dust from the ceilings. Inside, things got weird. The bunker was crammed with Nazi officials, SS guards, and staff. The despair was off the charts, but they kept up a bizarre parody of normal life. Generals would show up for meetings to plan counterattacks with armies that didn't even exist anymore. For most, the main activity became heavy drinking and chain smoking just to numb the tension. And at the center of it all was Adolf Hitler. The Führer, once the most feared man on the planet, was now a stooped, shuffling 56-year-old man. His left hand trembled all the time from what experts now think was Parkinson's disease. He would hide out in the lower bunker for days, only coming out for late-night military meetings where he would scream at his generals, blaming them for everything. Right there, watching it all, was Traudl Junge. Hired in 1942 when she was just 22, she wanted to be a ballerina, but her typing skills landed her a job as one of Hitler's personal secretaries. She later admitted she was totally naive and didn't care about politics, confessing she felt incredible guilt for having liked the greatest criminal who ever lived. To her, Hitler was just a pleasant boss and a fatherly friend. Now, that pleasant boss was about to bring the world down with him. Junge chose to stay with him to the very end, and she was about to type the final words of the Third Reich. But first, the final domino had to fall. It didn't come from a Soviet gun, but from a radio broadcast. The real countdown to Hitler's death started on April 28, 1945. For days, he'd been clinging to fantasies, ordering imaginary armies to save Berlin. On April 22nd, after a screaming meltdown where he finally admitted the war was lost, he announced he would stay in Berlin and die. But even then, one more shock was coming. A BBC News report came in that was so unthinkable, it sent Hitler into the biggest rage of his life. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, the man Hitler called the faithful Heinrich, had been secretly trying to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies behind his back. For Hitler, this was the ultimate betrayal. Himmler was the high priest of Nazi ideology. In Hitler's mind, he was the most loyal follower he had. Now, Himmler was telling the Allies he had the authority to surrender, basically trying to steal Hitler's power. The news absolutely shattered him. Witnesses said his face turned purple, and he trembled with a rage that seemed to shake the whole bunker. His anger needed a target. He ordered Himmler's arrest, a totally useless command since Himmler was long gone. But there was a scapegoat right there in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's guy on site. And Fegelein just happened to be married to Eva Braun's sister, making him Hitler's brother-in-law. Fegelein was caught trying to desert his post, dragged back, accused of treason, and shot in the Chancellery Garden. It was a brutal, swift execution, fueled by Hitler's rage at Himmler's betrayal. This was the final psychological blow. It convinced Hitler that his legacy and his final commands had to be written down, sealed, and sent out. He wasn't just going to die. He was going to make one last speech to history. And he needed someone to type it. That evening, after his rage had cooled into a grim determination, he called for Traudl Junge. The dictation was about to begin. Late on April 28th, Hitler walked up to Traudl Junge. His entire demeanor had changed. The insane rage was gone, replaced by a weird, eerie calm. He asked her if she'd gotten any sleep, then led her into the conference room. It was time. Junge later said the scene was completely surreal. Hitler, the man who held massive crowds in trance, was now pacing back and forth, monotonously dictating his final thoughts. She sat at a small table, typing away as the dull thuds of Soviet shells hitting the garden above punctuated the clatter of the keys. With the likely help of Joseph Goebbels, he had prepared 2 documents, a personal will and a political testament. He started with the personal will. It was surprisingly short and boring for a man at the end of the world. He finally, officially recognized his relationship with Eva Braun, the woman he had hidden from the public for years. He wrote that he had decided to take as his wife the woman who came to Berlin of her own free will in order to share my fate. He said she would die with him at her own desire. Next, his stuff, his massive art collection, filled with stolen masterpieces, would go to a new gallery in his hometown. His personal items were to go to his relatives and loyal staff, like his secretaries. Then the final statement. I myself and my wife, in order to escape the disgrace of deposition or capitulation, choose death. He gave explicit orders for their bodies to be burned immediately. Then he moved to his political testament, and the calm was gone. It was replaced with pure venom. This was his last, unrepentant speech. He started by repeating the lie that Germany hadn't wanted the war in 1939. The blame, he insisted, belonged to one group, international Jewry. In his final hours, with his capital city in ruins, his obsession was the only thing left. He charged his followers to maintain the laws of race and show merciless opposition to the Jews. No remorse, no self-reflection. He then officially expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party, calling them traitors. In their place, he named a new government for a country that didn't exist anymore. Admiral Karl Donitz would be the new president, and Joseph Goebbels the new chancellor. It was a complete fantasy. Junge typed frantically, making 3 copies of each document. She was transcribing the final thoughts of a man who had burned the world and felt nothing but righteous hatred to the very end. The dictation ended around 4 a.m. And if you thought it couldn't get any weirder, you'd be wrong. First, Hitler had his witnesses, Goebbels, Bormann, and 2 generals sign the testaments. He was obsessed with getting these documents out, ordering couriers to break through the Soviet lines at any price. Then came the second, and by far the strangest, event of the night, the wedding. Having finally acknowledged Eva Braun in his will, Hitler decided to make it official. They pulled a minor city official named Walter Wagner from his post fighting in the streets to perform a civil ceremony in the bunker's map room. The scene was a grotesque joke. Eva Braun wore a black silk dress, her favorite. Hitler stood next to her in his uniform jacket. The official asked and confirmed they were of pure Aryan descent, and they both said yes. When it came time to sign the marriage certificate, Eva started to write B for her maiden name Braun, then crossed out and wrote Eva Hitler. She got a new last name for a life that had less than 40 hours left. After the ceremony, they had a grim wedding breakfast with champagne and sandwiches. The mood was awful. Hitler barely spoke. For Eva, now Frau Hitler, it was a twisted fulfillment of a 16-year dream, realized only on the edge of a mass grave. The party broke up, and everyone went back to waiting for the end. The final day had begun. The hours after the wedding were tense and quiet. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Hitler was now focused on just one thing, the practical details of his own death. And this is where one of the most chilling episodes of his final days happened. His paranoia was out of control. The cyanide capsules he had were from the SS, Himmler's organization. What if they were fakes? A final betrayal to let him be captured alive? He was terrified of ending up like Mussolini, whose body was desecrated by a mob. He had to know if the poison worked. So he decided to test it. The test subject was Blondie, his beloved German shepherd. Hitler was famously a huge dog lover, and Blondie was always at his side. He loved that dog, probably more than any human around him. Hitler called in his doctor, Werner Hasse, and ordered him to give a cyanide capsule to Blondie. Dr. Hasse forced the dog's mouth open and crushed the glass ampoule. Blondie died instantly. According to witnesses, Hitler showed zero emotion. He just stared at his dead pet's body, his only concern being that the poison was legit. One nurse later said that the death of the dog seemed to upset the bunker staff more than Eva Braun's impending suicide. This single act showed how deep his coldness ran. His love for his dog was no match for his own personal terror. The message was clear. The end was here. To finish the job, Hitler ordered his dog handler to take Blondie's 5 puppies into the garden and shoot them. He also killed Eva Braun's 2 dogs. The bunker was being systematically purged of life. It was a dress rehearsal. By midday on April 30th, everything was ready. All that was left was to say goodbye. Around 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun came out of their private rooms. They walked down the main passageway where the last remaining staff had gathered for a funeral-like farewell. The group included Goebbels, Bormann, the generals, and the secretaries, including Traudl Junge. Hitler went down the line, shaking each person's hand. His face was gray, his eyes were distant, and he mumbled a few quiet words to each of them. When he got to Traudl Junge, the woman who had just typed his hateful testament, his words were not about politics or the Reich. According to her, he looked at her softly and said something like, "It's all over. It's all for nothing." Then he told her, "Try to get out, join one of the groups, and try to make your way west." This is a final, insane paradox of Adolf Hitler. The man who had just blamed international Jewry for everything now stood before his 25-year-old secretary and spoke only of her survival. It was no longer the Führer. It was a fatherly friend giving one last piece of advice. He even gave her and the other secretary cyanide capsules as a parting gift, just in case. It was a terrifying display of how evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy. After shaking everyone's hand, Hitler and Eva Braun turned and walked back to their suite. The heavy steel door closed, sealing them off. Everyone left in the hallway stood in stunned silence. They just had to wait for the sound. The minutes after the door closed felt like an eternity. Traudl Junge went to the upper bunker to be with the 6 Goebbels children, who were playing, totally unaware their parents were about to murder them. The contrast was horrifying. Down below, the silence was absolute. Magda Goebbels was sobbing. Everyone else just stared at the steel door. Then, around 3:30 p.m., it came. As Traudl Junge put it, suddenly, there's the sound of a shot, so loud, so close, that we all fall silent. It echoes on through all the rooms. One of the Goebbels kids, hearing the noise, yelled out, "That was a bullseye," having no idea how right he was. Hitler was dead. After a few moments, his valet and an SS adjutant pushed the door open. The smell of bitter almonds, cyanide, hit them. The scene was quiet and gruesome. Eva Hitler was slumped on the sofa. She had bitten into a cyanide capsule. Next to her sat Adolf Hitler. According to eyewitnesses, he had done both. He bit down on a cyanide pill while shooting himself in the right temple with his pistol. The plan from Israel kicked in immediately. His staff wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them up 4 flights of stairs, and out into the bombed-out Chancellery Garden. Soviet shells were still falling. The small group of SS guards put the bodies into a shallow crater and doused them with nearly 50 gallons of gasoline. Martin Bormann and Otto Gunsch lit a rag and tossed it in. A massive fireball erupted. As the flames consumed the bodies of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, the small group stood back, gave one last stiff-arm Nazi salute, and then retreated back into the concrete tomb. With Hitler gone, the bunker descended into total chaos. On May 1st, after Joseph and Magda Goebbels poisoned their 6 children and then killed themselves, Traudl Junge fled with a small group. She was eventually captured by the Soviets, handed over to the Americans, and finally released in 1946. She tried to live a quiet life, but she was haunted by what she had been a part of. She was crushed by a deep, complicated guilt, not just for serving Hitler, but for her own blindness. I admit, I was fascinated by Adolf Hitler, she confessed in the documentary film just before her death. He was a pleasant boss and a fatherly friend. I deliberately ignored all the warning voices inside me. This confession is the entire point. The man who dictated a final testament dripping with pure hate was the same man who showed her fatherly kindness. His final words to the world were a curse, but his final personal words to his secretary were a calm instruction to save herself. In 2002, just before she died, Traudl Junge talked about seeing a memorial for Sophie Scholl, a German student who was executed in 1943 for resisting the Nazis, the same year Junge started working for Hitler. Junge realized they were the same age. At that moment, she said, I really sensed it was no excuse to be so young. I could perhaps have tried to find out about things. Traudl Junge died just hours after the documentary about her life premiered. Her story is a terrifying, first-hand account how easily normal people can be pulled into the orbit of absolute evil, blinded by a pleasant boss until it's far too late. Thank you for watching this insane story about the final hours of the Third Reich. If you found this as mind-blowing as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let us know in the comments, what was the absolute craziest part of this story to you? And you have to check out our next video, where we investigate the fates of the high-ranking Nazis who actually managed to escape the bunker. See you there.